Sometimes a single sound can stir what 1,000 words could never reach. And when an old church bell tolls twice in a town that fears memory more than murder, someone is bound to be listening. Where in the world are you tuning in from? What time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments. Let's begin the story. The coastal mist clung to the winding road like a secret unwilling to be told. Jessica Fletcher's cab rumbled gently through the narrow lanes of Belhaven, a village she hadn't visited in decades but remembered with fondness. The clapboard houses wore salt-kissed paint, and the air carried that familiar blend of pine and seaweed. Waiting outside the modest inn with a welcoming smile and a thick wool shawl was Edith Winslow, Jessica's friend from her college days. Her frame had thinned, her hair gone silver, but her voice still had the lilt of their shared youth. "Jessie," Edith said, pulling her into a warm embrace, "you haven't changed a bit." Jessica laughed gently. "And you, Edith, look like you've weathered this sea air better than the buildings have." They strolled up the cobbled path toward Edith's home, a gabled cottage filled with lace curtains and the faint scent of lavender oil. Jessica's luggage was already waiting by the door, and a kettle hissed softly in the kitchen. "So, the bell's finally being dedicated," Jessica said, easing onto the sitting-room sofa. Edith nodded, her smile faltering just slightly. Yes, Silas would have been proud. Silas Hargrove, the village's beloved reverend, had passed unexpectedly the winter before. His final wish had been to restore the ancient bell in St. Anselm's Church, a relic that had been silent for over a century. Now it would toll again at the dedication ceremony, just 2 days away. Jessica glanced out the window. The fog had thickened, blurring the church steeple in the distance like a painting still wet at the edges. She couldn't explain it, not yet. But something in the quiet pressed just a little too firmly on her thoughts. Jessica awoke the next morning to the haunting peal of a bell, not once, but twice. The sound shuddered through the stillness like a ripple across glass. From her upstairs window, she saw neighbors emerging onto their porches, brows knitted, lips parted in puzzled stillness. The church bell hadn't rung in over 100 years. That it tolled now, and twice, had sent a tremor through the town. By the time Jessica came downstairs, Edith was standing by the front door, her hands tightly clasped around a teacup gone cold. "You heard it too?" Edith said quietly. Jessica nodded. "Twice. That's unusual." "More than unusual," Edith replied, a chill in her voice. "There's an old saying in Belhaven, if the bell tolls twice at dawn, something terrible is coming." Jessica raised an eyebrow. "You never struck me as superstitious." "I'm not," Edith said, too quickly. Later that morning, at the village cafe, Jessica overheard fragments of conversation. "Bad omen." "Silas wouldn't have allowed it." "First time since the Carter drowning." It was subtle, but palpable. The village had shifted slightly off its axis. Jessica tucked the observation away. In her experience, fear often had a root, not in fantasy, but in memory. Later that afternoon, Jessica wandered to St. Anselm's, where the faint hum of a pipe organ floated through the open doors. Inside, the air was cold and slightly musty. The pews dusted clean in anticipation of the dedication. Behind the organ sat a man in his mid-30s, tall but slouched, his fingers hesitating over the keys as if the music were keeping a secret from him. He didn't notice Jessica at first, not until a bench creaked beneath her step. He turned abruptly. "Oh, you startled me." "Sorry," Jessica said gently. "You play beautifully." The man gave a tired smile. "Micah Price. I'm the organist, and the occasional handyman, and reluctant choir director." "Jessica Fletcher," she offered. "I'm staying with Edith Winslow." Micah's face changed slightly at the name, though he recovered quickly. "Yes, Edith's been very devoted to this restoration." Jessica sat in the pew nearest him. "You were here this morning, I imagine?" Micah nodded, rubbing his temple. I was tuning, or trying to. Then the bell rang, twice. And that was unexpected. His hands dropped from the keys. That bell isn't supposed to ring at all until the dedication, and not twice. A pause. It's not right. Jessica studied him. There was something taut in the way he spoke, like a man whose nerves had been tuned too finely. "Do you think someone did it deliberately?" she asked. Micah hesitated. "I think someone wanted it heard." That evening, back in Edith's parlour, Jessica relayed the encounter with Micah. She watched her friend carefully, the way her gaze drifted toward the fireplace, the way her fingers fussed with her teacup. "Micah's always been intense," Edith said after a moment. "Sensitive. Perhaps a bit too wrapped up in the old stories." "Stories?" Jessica asked. Edith offered a tight smile. "About the bell, about curses and consequences. Most of us have learned to ignore them." Jessica nodded thoughtfully. And yet no one seemed able to ignore it this morning. For a flicker of a second, Edith's composure faltered. She looked away just long enough for Jessica to notice. "I think," Jessica said gently, "Micah may be worried about more than superstition." Edith said nothing for a long moment. Then quietly, "If something is stirring, Jess, I wish it had waited." Later that night, Jessica found herself browsing a photo album Edith had left open on the sitting room table, a collection of town events, parish moments, and church anniversaries spanning decades. Near the back, one photo stood out, a black and white image of Reverend Silas standing beside several parishioners outside the church. But something about the picture made Jessica pause. One of the faces had been scratched out, carefully, precisely. Not a tear or accidental mark, a deliberate removal. She turned to ask Edith about it, but the older woman had already gone to bed. Jessica closed the album slowly, her fingers resting on the torn edge of the photo. In her experience, people rarely erase a face unless they wish to forget it, and even more rarely, unless they can't. Jessica sat at the window of the guest room, notebook on her lap, the moonlight catching the edge of her pen. There were no shouts, no sirens, no visible signs of danger. And yet Belhaven felt as though it were bracing for something woven tightly into its past. The bell had tolled twice. A man of faith was gone, and a quiet tension gripped the town like fog along the coast. She wrote a single line in her notebook. Some silences are kept, others are forced. A breeze rustled the trees outside. From across the distance, the silhouette of St. Anselm's tower loomed, still and solemn against the night sky. Jessica closed the notebook gently. Somewhere in this village, someone was trying to speak, whether through music, memory, or fear. And someone else, she suspected, was trying just as hard to stop them. The day of the dedication dawned clear and brittle, as if the air itself had been wrung clean by salt and memory. Jessica stood beside Edith beneath the arched entrance of St. Anselm's, her coat drawn close and the stone steps echoing with polite murmurs from the gathering crowd. The mayor, Halton Dries, broad-shouldered and polished, raised his hand to speak. His words were ceremonial, well-rehearsed, touched by just enough warmth to sound sincere. "And so let us honour the memory of Reverend Silas Hargrove, whose faith and vision restored this bell, not only in brass and rope, but in spirit." A hush swept through the crowd. Bong! The bell rang, deep and resonant. People smiled. Some placed hands on their hearts. Then came the second. Bong! It hung heavier, slower, as though dredged from some place beneath memory. Jessica turned slightly, eyes narrowing. Edith's lips had parted, not in reverence, but dread. Around them the energy shifted, quietly, as if a long-held breath had been released too soon. Jessica didn't speak, but inside, something tightened. The bell had tolled again, not once, but twice. A signal, perhaps, or a warning. The ceremony faltered. Mayor Dries lowered his hand, glancing up toward the belfry with a furrowed brow, Somewhere behind the organ, a sharp gasp, followed by the scrape of shoes on wood. Jessica was the first to move, instinct guiding her toward the narrow staircase that led to the choir loft. It wasn't the sight of Micah Price's body that stunned her. It was the silence that surrounded it. He lay sprawled beside the organ bench, one arm bent unnaturally beneath him. His eyes were open, his expression caught between surprise and something softer, as though whatever he'd seen at the last had unsettled and soothed him in equal measure. The sheriff arrived moments later, his boots loud against the wooden steps. "Looks like he lost his footing," Tom Sutter muttered, kneeling. "Tuning the organ, most likely. These boards are treacherous." Jessica remained quiet. But her gaze had already swept the small space. No broken railing, no signs of struggle. A pair of shoes placed side by side beneath the organ, not flung, not scattered, but arranged with care. And the organ bench itself, the cushion askew, a torn piece of sheet music caught beneath one leg. She didn't speak her doubts, not yet, but the bell's second toll had come before this, not after. As the townsfolk were gently ushered from the church, Jessica lingered in the loft, her thoughts pulling her inward. Micah's shoes, brown leather, well worn but clean, had been placed deliberately. She crouched beside them, her hand hovering just above the scuffed toes. There was reverence in their positioning, not accident. She reached for the crumpled sheet beneath the organ bench. The title was smudged, the ink bled slightly, but she could still make out a few bars. It wasn't a hymn she recognized, though the melody carried the structure of something deeply personal. Nearby, a single envelope poked out from beneath a stack of hymnals. Jessica drew it free. It was empty, but the torn edges suggested haste. The faint scent of lavender lingered, unexpected in a church loft. Fold marks in the paper hinted at a once enclosed note. On the back, barely visible, an initial in pencil. A. Jessica stared at it for a long moment. Who was A? She thought of Micah's guarded demeanor, his unease, the weight behind his few words. The letter might have held the answer, or been the reason he died. Not everything about the moment felt staged, but something about it did. Downstairs, Sheriff Sutter leaned against a stone pillar, his hands stuffed in his pockets. He offered Jessica a tired smile as she approached. "I know that look," he said. "You're not convinced." Jessica paused, studying him. "It's not that I'm certain something happened, only that the scene doesn't quite align with the story we're meant to accept." "You think someone killed Micah Price?" He glanced toward the loft. "Come now, Jessica. The man was under pressure. Organ repairs, the ceremony. Maybe he slipped. Maybe he wasn't sleeping well." Jessica nodded politely, but didn't speak. She'd learned long ago that protests only pushed people into corners. Let them talk, let them believe. The truth, if it existed, would surface on its own. "Besides," Tom added, "no sign of forced entry, no marks on the body. Tragic accident, that's all." He sounded rehearsed, but accidents didn't come with carefully removed letters. Word spread faster in Belhaven than fog on the harbour. By dusk, whispers filled the inn's dining room, the post office, and even the florist's porch swing. Jessica passed two older women near the general store, their voices hushed. "They say the bell tolled twice for Carter before the drowning. And for Nora Hensley, the day her barn caught fire." "I'm telling you, it's a warning." Jessica turned into the bakery, feigning interest in a fruit tart, but her ears stayed open. Behind the counter, a teenager spoke softly to his grandmother. Micah was always kind of strange, but he didn't deserve that. Back at Edith's, the parlor was dimly lit. The air felt heavier than before. "You've heard the rumors," Edith said as she poured tea, not asking, but confirming. Jessica met her eyes. "Yes." Edith set the teapot down, her fingers trembling slightly. "There's something in this village, Jess. Something that doesn't want the past stirred." Jessica's thoughts returned to the scratched-out photograph, to the torn sheet music, to the empty envelope marked A. A second toll of the bell. Not an accident, but a summoning, and somewhere, someone knew why. Jessica moved through Belhaven with the ease of someone neither local nor stranger. The polite smiles she received came easily, but the conversations did not. People were talking about the bell, the death, the whispers of old legends. But none of them seemed eager to speak directly to her about Micah Price. At the post office, Mrs. Elva Hartridge, who had once been the church secretary, handed Jessica her receipt with a lowered voice. "I always said that boy was too clever for his own good," she murmured. "He kept things locked up. Secrets." "What kind of secrets?" Jessica asked gently. Elva hesitated. "Ledgers, old donation books, choir records. Said he was cataloguing them for the Historical Society, but I never saw anything published." It was a curious detail. Cataloguing was one thing, withholding was another. Later, at the grocer, Jessica ran into Jonas Kipp, the church's part-time caretaker and sometime handyman. His hands were stained with wood varnish, and his voice was gravelly with disuse. "I told them," he muttered when Jessica brought up Micah. "That old organ was cursed. Shouldn't have touched it." "Do you mean cursed?" Jessica asked. "Or simply broken?" Jonas stared at her. "Does it matter now?" She didn't press. Not yet, but she noted the edge in his voice, not sorrow, anger. Jessica had long learned that in close-knit towns, grief and resentment often dressed in the same coat. Jessica found Mayor Halton Dries at the town office, overseeing a delivery of bronze plaques for the church dedication. He greeted her with a broad politician's smile, the kind that had been worn into habit. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said, "what a pleasure. Edith told me you were visiting. Always admired your work." "Thank you, Mayor," Jessica said, her voice as pleasant as her eyes were sharp. "Though I hadn't expected my visit to involve a tragedy." "Ah," his smile faltered. "Yes, a terrible loss. Micah was passionate." She waited. He offered nothing further. "Some say the two of you disagreed about funding," she said, conversationally. He chuckled, but there was no humour in it. "Micah wanted more money for the organ than we had to give. He thought the restoration was sacred. I thought it was expensive." "And the records?" she asked. "Church archives are church property," he said smoothly. "I don't meddle in such things." Jessica nodded, though the answer struck her as too well prepared. On the mayor's desk was a stack of papers, invoices, she presumed. But one slip caught her eye, a letterhead for Mariner Holdings, a real estate firm from Portland, folded slightly into a property survey. A casual misplacement or something more? She asked no further questions, but she left with one thought humming quietly. What interest would the mayor of a sleepy village have in a commercial real estate group from out of town? St. Anselm's was locked, but the adjacent parish hall was open, where Jessica found Sarah Cole arranging flowers with the kind of focus reserved for those avoiding thought. The pastor's daughter looked up, brushing a curl from her face. "Mrs. Fletcher, I'm sorry you had to see. What happened?" Jessica approached gently. "You and Micah were close, weren't you?" Sarah's hands froze over a vase. "We worked together, choir arrangements. He helped me with some of the music training for the children." Jessica tilted her head. "There are rumors that your relationship was personal." Sarah laughed, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Belhaven loves a story." "But sometimes," Jessica said softly, "stories grow from something real." Sarah's jaw tightened. "I was engaged to someone else, and Micah, he had his demons." Jessica noted the shift, a subtle attempt to change the subject. She didn't press, not yet. Instead, she looked down at the table where a torn page from a hymn book had been folded into a makeshift bookmark. "Led Kindly Light" was the marked piece, a melancholic choice for a wedding. "He didn't die by accident, did he?" Sarah asked suddenly, voice barely above a whisper. Jessica met her gaze. Why would you ask that? But Sarah turned away, staring at the stained glass window. Jessica felt the crack in the surface. It wasn't grief alone that lived in Sarah Cole. It was fear. And perhaps regret. Jonas Kipp was repairing a pew rail when Jessica found him later that afternoon, tucked in the far corner of the church sanctuary. His fingers moved with methodical precision, but the lines on his face had deepened since the day before. Jessica approached quietly. "Jonas, may I trouble you?" He didn't look up. "If it's about the organ, I've said what I'm going to say." "Only that it's cursed," Jessica said gently, "which, if true, might explain a great deal." Jonas huffed, half annoyance, half dismissal. "That thing's too old to be cursed. It's just been mistreated, overplayed, underfixed." Jessica's gaze drifted toward the choir loft. Micah seemed to believe something else. Jonas's hands stilled. "I understand he kept certain documents, church ledgers, donation records. Do you know where he stored them?" "He said the old filing room was damp," Jonas muttered. "Started using the vestry cabinets, locked them, wouldn't let me near." "And you found that unusual?" "I found it disrespectful." His eyes finally met hers. That church was Silas's life. Micah treated it like a vault. Jessica studied his expression. Wounded pride, not guilt. But strong enough to cloud judgment, perhaps strong enough to conceal something. "Did you argue?" she asked. Jonas looked away. "Not loud enough for anyone to hear." It wasn't a denial, and it wasn't cooperation either. Jessica had come to recognize that silence, too, could be a wall. Twilight settled over Belhaven with a stillness that made Jessica more alert, not less. She returned to the rectory where Reverend Silas had once lived, now unoccupied since his death. Edith had keys, of course. "In case anyone needs to retrieve a robe," she'd said. But Jessica suspected Edith knew, deep down, that wasn't the only reason. The parlor smelled faintly of pipe smoke and lavender polish. Jessica moved through the quiet with careful steps, pausing near the cold hearth. Inside, buried beneath blackened wood chips and pale dust, a sliver of scorched parchment caught her eye. She knelt. It had once been sheet music. The edge still bore fragments of staff lines and notations, but most of it was charred. Still, one line remained legible. "Let the bell ring once for the sin, once for the truth." A hymn? A message? A confession? Jessica turned the scrap over. On the reverse, faint pencil markings. Barely legible initials. M.P. Micah Price. She stood slowly, the edges of the paper crumbling slightly in her hand. Someone had tried to destroy this. Not discard. Destroy. Why? Because it was a hymn? Or because it was a record? Music, Jessica thought, could be a language. And Micah may have been speaking in notes when no one would listen to his words. Back at Edith's that evening, Jessica sat in the lamplight, a worn hymnal opened before her, and Micah's scorched fragment laid beside it. She traced the remaining notes, humming softly under her breath. The melody was gentle but strange, a familiar progression interrupted by a half-step fall where none should be. A dissonant pause, a hesitation, not a mistake, a message. Jessica had seen it before, in old war diaries, in coded letters, in the private margin notes of grieving composers. Patterns designed to look accidental, when they were anything but. Micah had written this intentionally. She glanced again at the title. Once for the sin, once for the truth. Perhaps the bell tolls were not warnings, but markers, points in time aligned with actions. One for the sin, one for the truth. Which one had Micah carried with him when he died? There was an uncomfortable logic forming in Jessica's mind, one in which Micah hadn't merely stumbled into the past, but uncovered it, preserved it, and paid the cost for trying to make it heard. Music was his voice, and now she had to learn how to listen. The next morning, Jessica passed the hardware store just as two men were unloading crates. One of them, a wiry local named Vince Gallagher, paused when he spotted her. "You're the writer, right?" he asked. "Hear about Micah?" Jessica stopped. "I'm staying with Edith, yes." Vince wiped his hands on his apron. "Shame what happened, but to be honest, I'm not surprised." "Oh?" He leaned in slightly, conspiratorial. "Micah had problems, with the drink." Jessica didn't respond, letting the silence draw more out of him. "He used to come by here late. Slurred words, red eyes. Couple of us even saw him stumbling out of the rectory one night." She offered a kind nod and moved on, but the moment stayed with her. She had seen Micah's shoes, neatly placed, his clothes clean. His gaze, when he'd looked at her, sharp, not dulled. And Edith had said nothing about alcohol in the rectory. Nor had Jonas. The timing of this rumor felt convenient. Too convenient. A bottle made a tidy explanation, but it also made an effective smear. Jessica paused outside the churchyard, eyes narrowing at the belfry once more. If someone wanted Micah discredited, posthumously silenced, a drinking problem was a very useful lie, and perhaps the most telling clue yet. The Belhaven Library was as Jessica remembered it, a quiet retreat of oak shelves, uneven floorboards, and the scent of paper too long in the sun. She had come to follow a name she'd seen scribbled on the inside cover of an old hymnal, Silas Hargrove, 1974, a name that had begun to feel more like a shadow than a memory. Behind the desk was Mabel Girth, the librarian of 40 years and a gatekeeper of more than books. Jessica approached with a gentle smile. "I was hoping," she said, "you might help me with a bit of local history, something ecclesiastical." Mabel's eyebrows lifted with wary amusement. "You mean Silas's time at St. Anselm's?" "Exactly. Particularly any records of, conflict, disagreements, that sort of thing." For a moment Mabel hesitated, a flicker of calculation in her eyes. Then she turned, retrieving a thin binder from a locked drawer. "Never checked out, but never discarded," she said, placing it before Jessica. "Not many people ask about that chapter." Inside, yellowed pages, clipped newsletters, handwritten notes, a scrawled sermon draft in Silas's distinct cursive. Then a name, Aaron Dries. Jessica paused. Was he related to Halton Dries? "His father," Mabel confirmed. "Silas excommunicated him in 1975. Something about misused church funds caused quite the fracture." Jessica leaned back. The pieces shifted again. Silas had cast out a man for betrayal, and that man had a son now running Belhaven. The next morning, Jessica walked the harbour path alone, her thoughts tight as the breeze. A name, once buried, had resurfaced. Not as a footnote, but as a root. Aaron Dries had left Belhaven under a cloud of shame, she'd learned. But now whispers hinted that his son, or was it someone else entirely, had returned long before Micah's death, and under a name unfamiliar to most. Back at the cafe, Jessica sat with a warm cup of coffee and a copy of the Belhaven Chronicle, dated 3 years prior. Her fingers stopped on a small column. New director, appointed to Historical Land Trust, Jonathan Harrow, Portland. A picture accompanied it. The face was thinner, hair darker, but unmistakably familiar. Jessica studied it closely. The lines of the mouth, the eyes. A resemblance not to Halton, but to an old photograph in the church archive. A younger Aaron Dries. Was Jonathan Harrow a pseudonym? And if so, had Micah discovered this deception? A man once cast out might return not with vengeance, but with patience and plans. Jessica's thoughts turned to the burned hymn, the hidden records, the land deeds Micah had supposedly reviewed. Perhaps the past wasn't just a cause of guilt. Perhaps it had become a business model. That evening, Jessica found Edith on the back porch, knitting in silence. The light was fading, and the air smelled of salt and late autumn. Jessica took a seat beside her and waited. After a long moment, Edith spoke without prompting. You already know, don't you? Jessica nodded once. Not everything, just enough to worry. Edith reached into the folds of her cardigan and pulled out a crumpled envelope. This came 3 nights ago. I found it slipped under the door. Jessica opened it carefully. The note was brief, typed in block letters. Some truths stay buried for good reason. Stay silent. No signature. No return address? Jessica asked. Edith shook her head, only the feeling that someone had been watching the house. Jessica studied her old friend's face, drawn tight, but not broken. There was more beneath the surface, not just fear, but shame. You knew what Aaron had done, Jessica said gently, even before Silas acted. Edith's hands trembled. He was my cousin, Jess, and I thought keeping quiet would be the last damage done. Jessica let the silence stretch between them. Guilt could be a quiet companion, until someone rang the bell. After her conversation with Edith, Jessica returned to St. Anselm's, ostensibly to leave flowers, a gesture the town would expect. But her mind had been circling a more physical question all morning. How had the bell rung? Inside the nave she paused, letting her gaze adjust to the amber-lit gloom. Then she moved quietly toward the narrow stairwell behind the altar, where the bell tower rose. The rope, thick with age and tradition, hung heavily. But when Jessica ran her fingers along its length, she felt it. An unnatural friction, a split in the braiding about 2/3 of the way up. The fibers were slightly frayed, as though someone had pulled it from above, not below, not with ceremony, with urgency. She followed the coil to its base. Around the floor lay tiny strands, not enough for casual neglect, but too many for coincidence. Had someone rung the bell from the belfry? To create a timed distraction? Or to signal something? Jessica turned toward the spiral stairs but paused. This wasn't just about a bell. It was about when it rang, why it rang. The theory of accident grew thinner with each step of the rope. And someone had tugged at more than just the fibers. Later that day, Jessica found Sarah Cole alone in the sacristy, rearranging communion linens with the rigid precision of someone trying not to feel. Jessica entered gently. "Sarah, I wonder if I might speak with you." The young woman glanced up, wary. "I came across a letter," Jessica began carefully. "Something Micah had addressed to someone with the initial A." Sarah's breath caught just slightly. Jessica continued. "And I heard from more than one person that you and Micah shared something more than music." Sarah said nothing. Jessica softened. "I don't ask to judge, only to understand." Sarah's fingers gripped the edge of the linen. "There were rumors, of course, and I didn't do much to stop them." "Were they true?" Sarah swallowed. "Number, but I let them seem true." Jessica waited. "I was helping him," Sarah said. "We weren't lovers. He was scared. Not for himself, for what he'd found." Jessica stepped closer. What had he found? Sarah reached behind the vestment rack and retrieved a small, flat box. Inside were several sheets of brittle paper, faded typeface, property lists, annotations in red pencil. "Church donation records," she said. "Some of the land deeds. They don't match the public registry." Jessica looked at the dates. Several corresponded to Silas Hargrove's tenure, and 2 matched recent transactions Jessica had glimpsed on the mayor's desk. So Micah hadn't been entangled in romance. He'd been entangled in evidence, and Sarah had only tried to protect the truth. The next morning, Sheriff Sutter stopped Jessica just outside the general store. "Thought you'd want to know," he said, almost reluctant. "We found fragments of bell rope in Jonas Kipp's coat pocket, same type as what's frayed in the tower." Jessica kept her expression neutral. "That's interesting." "Isn't it?" the sheriff said. "He's been brooding since the dedication. Micah shut him out of the archives. Motive, opportunity, now physical evidence." Jessica nodded, but inwardly something resisted. Jonas might have been gruff, even resentful, but he was also proud of the church, A man like Jonas wouldn't desecrate the bell, not without cause and not without mess. That rope fibre, it could have been transferred any number of ways. Handling it, moving crates, even repairing the pulpit. "Has he been arrested?" she asked. "Brought in for questioning." Jessica glanced down the road toward the church, a rope in his pocket. And yet Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that Jonas was being made to fit someone else's shape. Evidence can be planted, but guilt is harder to fake. And someone in Belhaven knew that better than most. The nave of St. Anselm's was cloaked in quiet shadow, lit only by the soft moonlight slipping through stained glass. Jessica had intended only to retrieve her scarf, left draped on the pew after evening service. But as she stepped into the sanctuary, a familiar melody echoed from the loft above. It wasn't a hymn. It was slower, halting, more like a thought being shaped than a song being performed. She climbed the stairs gently, the wood groaning beneath her step. At the organ sat Eli, the altar boy. Barely 14, he hunched over the keys, his fingers uncertain but intent. Jessica didn't speak until he finished. "That was beautiful," she said softly. Eli startled, his hands lifting quickly from the keys. "I didn't mean, I wasn't supposed to—" "You're not in trouble," Jessica assured him. "But it's late, and this place hasn't felt peaceful lately." Eli looked down. "I didn't want to play it at home. It doesn't sound the same anywhere else." She stepped beside him. "Micah used to say that, didn't he?" Eli hesitated, then nodded. He said the church carried things like echoes, secrets. Jessica watched the boy's face, drawn, young, but older now than when she'd first met him. He was holding something, and Jessica gently meant to let him speak it. Eli sat motionless for a moment before he spoke. "I was here that morning," he whispered. "The day the bell rang, I came early to light the candles, but I got curious. So I went up to the loft." Jessica waited, saying nothing. "I heard voices. Only one, really, Micah's, but angry, not like him. And then I heard a sound, like something falling." His voice grew smaller. "I didn't go up, I froze." He clenched his hands in his lap. Then someone came down the stairs. Quiet, careful. "Did you see them?" Jessica asked gently. Eli nodded. "A robe, white, like the ceremonial ones, and gloves, the soft kind, like choir gloves. They didn't look at me." Jessica frowned, her mind already turning. The robe would mask most features, and gloves would prevent fingerprints. "Do you know who it was?" she asked. Eli shook his head. "I don't. But they didn't move like an old person, not slow, like they knew where they were going." She reached out, resting a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" "I tried to tell Mr. Sutter, but he just said I was imagining things." Jessica felt the tension rise behind her ribcage. A child's eyes were often keener than an adult's denials. And in this case, they had seen something no one else wanted noticed. They sat together in the quiet, the air in the loft tinged with candle wax and cedar polish. Jessica waited for Eli's breathing to settle again before speaking. "Micah trusted you, didn't he?" Eli's response came not as a boast, but a confession. "He said I listened better than most grown-ups, and I didn't ask dumb questions." Jessica smiled at that. That's often a good quality in both a friend and a detective. He blinked. "He showed me something once, said it wasn't safe in the open." Jessica leaned in slightly. "What was it?" "A journal, but not like a diary. It had notes, names, church donations from way back, and maps, like property lines, only crossed out and redrawn." Jessica's mind quickened. "Did you see whose names were in it?" "I remember one, Mr. Dries, but not the mayor, his dad." She straightened slightly, heart steady but alert. "Did Micah say why it mattered?" "He said it was proof that things people thought were gifted to the church were taken back." Sold, Jessica's voice was calm. Sold by whom? I don't know, Eli admitted. But Micah said if he didn't get the story told before the dedication, someone else would bury it for good. Jessica absorbed the boy's words carefully. Micah had uncovered Belhaven's oldest shame, not a legend, but a theft. And someone had made sure the bell tolled before he could tell the truth. Back at Edith's cottage later that night, Jessica spread the old documents Sarah had given her across the dining table, the land records, handwritten annotations, red marks circling property lots. Now, with Eli's testimony, the picture sharpened. It wasn't just church donations. These were plots supposedly gifted to the parish, plots Jessica now believed had been quietly reversed in title, then passed through dummy buyers and resold. Some of those lots now had cottages, others were being eyed for commercial development, and woven into it all was the Drees name, not Holton's, not directly, but Aaron's. His signature, faded but legible, appeared on at least 2 key transfers. Jessica recalled the name from Mabel Girth's files in the library. Micah must have pieced it together. A pattern hidden in plain view, in music, in titles, in hymnal ledgers and deed books. But he didn't go to the sheriff. Why? Because people in Belhaven didn't just bury the past, they protected it, venerated it. And Micah, a solitary musician with no family, had no one to vouch for him, except a child and a few scraps of paper. Jessica turned the final sheet over and found a penciled margin note in Micah's hand. If the bell rings before the song is played, the truth won't be heard. She sat back in her chair. Micah had known the risk, and yet he'd tried to make them listen, the only way he knew how. The next morning, Jessica stood in the choir loft again, alone now. The light through the east windows fell gently on the keys of the old organ. Micah's final composition, found folded inside the bench, barely more than 8 measures with no lyrics, but the title, inscribed in his careful script, read, "Twice shall the bell toll, once for the sin and once for the truth." Jessica played it slowly. The first half of the melody was simple, a descending scale, steady, mournful. The second lifted unexpectedly, a gentle resolution in a minor chord, not hopeful, exactly, but clear. She paused, studying the notation again. In the margins were small letters, A, D, S, just enough to be overlooked, unless one knew to look. Aaron, Drees, Silas. Jessica traced the notes, the structure, the symmetry. It was a confession in music, not just grief, but logic. A man who had no one to believe his words had chosen his legacy in measures and motifs. He had turned truth into music, and someone had made sure it was never heard. Jessica closed the lid of the organ softly, her thoughts steadied like hands over keys. The bell had tolled, but the real question still echoed within her. Who had made sure it tolled when it did, and why? That answer, she suspected, lay not in the music itself, but in those who had wanted it silenced. Jessica returned to Edith's cottage just past dusk. The warmth of the oil lamps inside did little to hide the tension folded into every shadow of the parlour. Edith stood near the fireplace, her knitting untouched in the basket at her feet. Jessica closed the door gently behind her. "You were in the bell tower that morning, weren't you?" Edith's shoulders stiffened. For a long moment, the silence between them was deeper than any denial. Then Edith spoke, her voice brittle. "I only wanted to warn him. I thought, if the bell rang early, if the townspeople grew superstitious, maybe Micah would hold back. Maybe he'd think twice." Jessica stepped closer. "You were trying to protect him?" "No," Edith said, shaking her head. "I was trying to protect the town, the people, their memories of Silas, of what they thought the church stood for." Jessica's tone remained soft. "And yet Micah ended up dead." Edith lowered herself into the armchair with a sigh that sounded more like surrender. I never meant harm. I rang it at dawn, pulled the rope myself. I used the robe to cover my clothes. Didn't want anyone recognizing me on the way." "And the gloves?" Jessica asked gently. "I have arthritis. I always wear them." Jessica studied her old friend, the tremor in her fingers, the fragile shame in her gaze. It wasn't malice, but it had been a mistake, and someone else, she now suspected, had taken advantage of that mistake. By mid-morning, Jessica had quietly requested everyone gather in the chapel, not as an accusation, but as a reckoning. Mayor Holton Dries arrived first, his overcoat impeccable, his expression faintly annoyed. Sarah Cole came shortly after, her posture guarded but curious. Jonas Kipp shuffled in last, his brow furrowed, hands clasped tightly in front of him. Even Sheriff Sutter leaned against the doorframe, arms folded. Jessica stood at the lectern. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice calm but clear. "This isn't a courtroom, but there are questions that need answering, not only for Micah, but for Belhaven." She paused, then turned to the organ. Micah left behind a hymn, a final piece of music with a message hidden in its phrasing, its annotations. It wasn't just composition, it was confession, and in it he named the truth. The room remained hushed. Jessica's eyes settled briefly on Sarah, then on Jonas, and finally on the mayor. "You each had your reasons for wanting Micah silenced: guilt, resentment, fear of exposure, but only one person stood to lose not just reputation, but power." Dries's mouth tightened, but he said nothing. Jessica turned toward the choir loft. "There's one more thing, something that was left behind, something only the killer would have touched." She paused deliberately. "And it carries their fingerprint." There it was, a flicker across Dries's face. Not fear, not surprise. Just a moment of calculation interrupted. Jessica stepped slowly toward the organ bench, retrieving the folded hymn from where she had placed it in full view. "It was found in the choir loft," she said, "folded inside the bench, beneath Micah's usual seat, not scorched, not hidden, just left." She held it gently, as if the music itself might bruise. This version of the hymn was different from the others. Micah had annotated it with red pencil, initials, notes, dates, all pointing to land transfers. A symbolic confession. She let that hang for a moment. Most people wouldn't notice what mattered about the page. But the person who handled it last wore gloves to avoid leaving traces. Unfortunately for them, they removed the gloves at some point. Perhaps to adjust the bench, or perhaps in haste. Jessica turned toward Sheriff Sutter. "The lab confirmed a partial fingerprint, just enough. It belongs to Mayor Holton Dries." There was a long silence. Dries shifted his weight, his voice remarkably even. "So I touched a piece of music. That proves nothing." "No," Jessica said, "but combined with the hidden church documents Micah uncovered, the fraudulent land sales traced through shell companies, and the presence of rope fibers found near your tool shed, it tells a clearer story." Sarah let out a quiet gasp. Jonas looked to the floor. Dries's mask didn't crack. "I was preserving the town's legacy." Jessica met his gaze. "Legacies built on silence and theft are not worth preserving." Mayor Holton Dries did not move. He stood in the chapel as though the floor had frozen around him, hands relaxed at his sides, the polished buttons of his coat glinting beneath the stained glass light. But it was his expression that unnerved Jessica most. Not shock, not guilt, but something colder. Resignation touched with contempt. "You think you've solved it," he said softly, turning not to her, but to the congregation of eyes watching. "You think a hymn and a smudge of graphite undoes 40 years of service." Jessica kept her voice measured. "Service doesn't cancel wrongdoing, Mr. Dries. Micah found records showing that land donated to the church was fraudulently reabsorbed, resold, and laundered through shell buyers, all while your father's name, and later yours, remained conspicuously absent from public filings." "You make it sound so sinister," Dries replied, his voice rising ever so slightly. "Do you know what this town was in the 70s? Dying of rust and rot. My father salvaged it. I preserved it." "You profited from it," Jessica said. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Micah threatened to expose a past no one wanted unearthed. He thought he was righteous. He was just naive. "You confronted him the morning of the dedication," Jessica continued, unwavering. "You wore the robe and gloves Edith had used earlier. You staged his fall in the loft and made sure the bell tolled to confuse the timeline." Dries tilted his head. "And yet the bell tolled again, didn't it? And people listened." Jessica's voice was firm now. "Yes, because someone died for the truth, and now they'll hear it." The stillness in the chapel deepened, like the moment between lightning and thunder. Dries stood alone in the aisle, eyes roaming the pews that once held voters, donors, allies. Jessica stepped down from the choir loft steps. "You speak of legacy, but legacies aren't built on fear and silence. They're earned, not bought." His face remained composed, but his voice lost its edge. "You don't understand small towns. They break over scandal. They die from the inside." "I did what was necessary." "You did what was convenient," Jessica countered. "You used your father's disgrace as justification for deceit. You convinced yourself that hiding the truth would protect Belhaven, when all it did was hollow it out." Dries gave a tired laugh. "You think this town wanted the truth? You think Edith wanted to remember what her cousin had done? That Jonas wanted to be reminded he was passed over because he asked too many questions?" Jessica looked to them both. Edith, silent in the front pew, her eyes glistening. Jonas, jaw tight, arms crossed in bitterness. "No," Jessica said quietly, "but I believe they're ready now, because the truth may hurt for a time, but lies injure a town forever." Dries exhaled and turned toward Sheriff Sutter, who approached wordlessly. There was no struggle. Only a long silence as the handcuffs clicked shut. Jessica watched him go, a man who had confused control for care and who now walked into history for the wrong reason. As Dries was led out the chapel doors, a gust of wind slipped through the open arch and caught the tail of his coat, not as a dramatic flourish, but as an afterthought of weather. Still the congregation shivered. Jessica remained where she was, her hands gently folded on the lectern. The chapel, once heavy with tension, now carried something else, something quieter, weightier. A stillness not born of fear, but of realization. Micah's hymn sat on the organ bench. Sarah approached it tentatively and picked it up, as though unsure she had the right. Her voice broke the hush. "I'll play it this Sunday." Jessica nodded gently. He would have liked that. Jonas remained near the back. He didn't speak, but he offered Jessica a small nod. An apology, perhaps, for his earlier anger, or maybe gratitude for what hadn't been said. Edith moved slowly toward the altar and lit a single candle. Her hands trembled slightly, but she steadied them. Jessica watched her old friend and saw not guilt now, but mourning for Micah, for Silas, and perhaps for the Belhaven she once believed in. As the flame flickered, the bell above gave a low, unprompted creak. Not a toll, not a chime. Just the shift of wood and iron in the rafters, like a breath held, then released. Jessica remained silent as the town filtered out. The truth had not restored everything, but it had stopped the tolling. And for Belhaven, that would be a start. That evening, the sky above Belhaven was streaked with lavender and pewter, the kind of quiet dusk that seemed to ask for contemplation more than conversation. Jessica sat at Edith's writing desk, a leather-bound journal opened before her, a fountain pen resting in her fingers. She paused before writing. Some truths needed a moment to settle, like silt in water, before they could be put to words. Finally, she began. "The bell tolled twice, and perhaps it had to. Once for the memory of a good man, and once more to shake loose the secrets that shadowed Belhaven, she stopped, then continued slowly. Micah Price was not the loudest voice in this village. He was not powerful or popular or particularly assertive, but he was persistent. He believed in the truth not as a weapon, but as a kind of music, something that, if played clearly enough, could reach even those who didn't wish to hear it. Jessica leaned back for a moment, her gaze drifting toward the small window above the desk. The church steeple was visible from here, just a silhouette now, softened by distance. There are many ways to ring a bell. Some seek attention, some mark loss, others, the rarest kind, announce change. I believe Micah did the last of these, and though he didn't live to see what came after, he left the echo behind him. She gently closed the journal, her hand resting for a moment on the cover. There was still one photograph she hadn't yet returned to, and one face she hadn't yet identified. The photo album sat where she had left it, beside the bookshelf, its leather binding slightly frayed at the corners. Jessica pulled it onto her lap and opened to the page that had troubled her from the beginning. A black and white photograph of Reverend Silas Hargrove, surrounded by 5 other parishioners. The 6th face had been carefully scratched out. Jessica had been too polite to ask Edith directly. But now, with the story unfolded, the clues reassembled, and Dries behind bars, she felt it was time to look again. This time, not as a guest or a friend, but as someone who understood. She examined the background, the slope of the churchyard, the date on the banner behind them, the suit lapels and postures. Every detail whispered familiarity. But it was the figure on the far right, the stance, the broad shoulders, the slightly tilted chin, that aligned with what she had seen in an old municipal record book at the library. Aaron Dries, the father of Holton. The man excommunicated by Reverend Silas for financial impropriety, a name almost erased from memory and nearly from the town itself. Jessica ran her fingertip just beneath the scratched mark, delicate, as though touching a wound. She thought of Holton's words in the chapel. "You don't understand small towns." But she did. She understood that in small towns some faces are never truly forgotten, only buried. And in Belhaven, it wasn't the bell that had awakened the past. It was the silence that followed. Late the next morning, Jessica found Edith in the parlour, the scent of fresh tea and something faintly floral, lilac perhaps, drifting in the air. On the table between them sat a small wooden box, the lid open. Inside, folded neatly and wrapped in a linen handkerchief, was a single sheet of music. "I thought you should have this," Edith said quietly. Jessica unfolded the paper. It was a revised version of Micah's final hymn, "Light Through the Steeple." The title was written in his hand, but the lines of melody were more polished, more resolved. Not the coded cry of "Twice shall the bell toll." This was something different, something clear. "He must have written it after," Jessica murmured. "After he finished the other?" Edith nodded. "He said it came to him in pieces, that he wanted the village to hear something honest, something healing." Jessica studied the notes, the slow rise of the final line, the quiet return to the tonic chord. It was a song not of triumph, but of peace. "I'll see to it that Sarah plays it on Sunday," she said, "and that it's heard, this time, properly." Edith gave her a faint smile. Micah believed music could carry truth more gently than words. Jessica folded the paper carefully. Sometimes it carries it farther. The bell no longer tolled, but a song remained, and through it, a village that had been built on silence might, finally, begin to listen. Sunday morning arrived with a softness Belhaven hadn't known in some time. The sun broke gently across the rooftops, warming the slate of St. Anselm's steeple. Jessica sat quietly in a middle pew, Edith to her left, young Eli to her right, their silence companionable. The air inside the chapel was cool, touched with candle wax and polish, but it was the silence, the absence of dread, that struck Jessica most. The town had gathered not with fear this time, nor with suspicion, but with something rarer: intention. Sarah Cole stepped toward the organ, her fingers poised not only for performance, but remembrance. The first notes of Light Through the Steeple drifted into the space. It was a gentle melody, simple, unadorned, but with a quiet resilience in its phrasing. As the music swelled, Jessica felt it settle into the bones of the chapel, filling spaces left hollow for too long. No words were spoken, they weren't needed. Somewhere during the final verse, the bell in the tower rang, not twice, not as a warning or omen, but once, clear, steady, measured. Heads turned toward the sound, but no one panicked. Instead, there were shared glances, a few tears, the smallest of smiles. Jessica allowed her eyes to close for a moment, listening. The bell tolled not for the dead this time, nor the silenced, but for the living. And in that single note, Belhaven began to exhale. The next morning, Jessica's bag sat neatly packed at the foot of Edith's staircase. The autumn breeze had turned crisp again, stirring the ivy that curled around the porch rail. Edith walked her to the gate, arms folded against the morning chill. "You've left us something, Jess," she said. Jessica smiled. "No, Edith. I believe it was already here. It just needed to be heard." Edith looked toward the church tower in the distance. "It's strange, isn't it? That silence can be more dangerous than noise." Jessica's gaze followed hers. "And more lasting." The car arrived, its tires crunching the gravel. Jessica turned for one last look at the cottage, the narrow street, the steeple. All seemingly unchanged, yet not the same. She stepped inside the car with the calm of someone who had not defeated something, but revealed it. As the village receded behind her, Jessica opened her notebook once more. There would be more mysteries, more shadows, but for now, one village had chosen truth. And that, she thought, was no small victory. And so beneath the hush of old stained glass and the weight of unspoken truths, Belhaven began to breathe again. Not perfectly, but honestly. But I still wonder, was it the truth that set them free, or merely the courage to stop hiding it? What do you think? Did justice truly ring through that final toll? Share your thoughts or theories in the comments. I'd love to hear them. And if this mystery moved you, do give it a like, pass it along to a fellow sleuth, and subscribe if you'd care to uncover more stories where secrets linger just beneath the surface.